Starfield's Shattered Space expansion comes out in 20 days. And while Bethesda has shown a surprisingly minimal amount of gameplay around this expansion, thanks to various interviews, some previews, and even some potential leaks, we have gotten a flood of new details of what exactly you can expect from this one. Because some of these previews are saying that this is worth reinstalling the game over. This very realistically could be Starfield's turnaround moment, and once I get into some of the details of what exactly Shattered Space is, I think a lot of you guys are going to be interested. But I also think we need to temper some expectations over what Shattered Space isn't going to do. Up until this point, Shattered Space marketing has been surprisingly quiet. We really only have this one trailer from the summer showcase. Later on, we get a few new scenes in this Gamescom update, but it was just a few seconds of new gameplay, nothing substantially different. And while some users have been interpreting the lack of trailers as concerning for the state of Shattered Space, I actually think this makes a ton of sense. A ton of people, including many of you watching right now, already own this expansion. You purchased it with the Premium Edition upgrade for Starfield, likely so you could play several days early. We saw how the Steam player number didn't see that much of a bump after the early access period for premium players ended, suggesting that tons of people paid extra to play early. So now when you're looking at this from Bethesda's perspective, why spend a bunch of money on marketing if people already own the DLC? And just in general, Starfield was relatively light on marketing before its initial release, yet it still performed better than any other Bethesda release, so they're probably just using that same strategy here. But things are not all sunshine and rainbows for Starfield. On Steam right now, this game has some of the worst reviews of any mainline Bethesda game, with nearly 70,000 negative reviews at this point. But the thing getting me most excited about Shattered Space is Bethesda has made it clear that this was designed from the ground up with community feedback in mind. Speaking with Gaming Boulevard, Tim Lamb said, "Well, after the main game launched, we got a ton of feedback from the community. Players love the vastness of space and the freedom to explore. But we also heard a lot of requests for more narrative-driven content. They wanted stories that felt personal and impactful, something that would draw them even deeper into the universe." So that was really our starting point. We wanted to create a DLC that expanded the universe in a meaningful way, but also delivered on a narrative experience that felt rich and engaging. And right off the bat, this is incredibly exciting to me. We don't know exactly what went on with Starfield's DLC cycle. Shattered Space is releasing considerably later compared to when DLCs came out for both Skyrim and Fallout 4. So perhaps work had started on Shattered Space, but then in response to some of the feedback they're getting from the base game of Starfield, some things may have been reworked. And overall, it's being made quite clear here that Shattered Space is made with fan feedback in mind. And this isn't only going to be a change up in terms of responding to feedback around the content formatting. There's also a very deliberate theme swap happening with Shattered Space, because in the base game of Starfield, you have this giant galaxy, hopeful optimism, as well as traveling worlds and experiencing different cultures. But now in Shattered Space, you have this more secluded, focused, mysterious location. And that really is the second major pillar of what is making Shattered Space a really promising expansion, particularly for those who don't love the base game of Starfield. This will be a more horror-focused story, taking place on just one planet and largely just in one city. So if you're sick and tired of this dotting around, fast travel focused gameplay, Shattered Space is not going to have that anymore. The devs have explicitly confirmed as much. The core story, at least as we know it thus far, is pretty simple. House Va'ruun is in this distant and mysterious area outside of the settled systems. On their planet of Va'ruun Kai, an experiment went wrong that opened up these horrifying vortexes, which have the capital city of Dazra in disarray as monsters are coming through and wreaking havoc. We'll talk more about those a bit later in this video. We're going to be jumping into all of this 2 weeks after the fact. So there's 2 weeks for everything to go wrong and kind of marinate a little bit. We'll hear a distress signal from this now destroyed House Va'ruun ship. That's what we could see in the trailer that was shared thus far. But from that ship, we'll gain the ability to go to this new system, and this will be what makes Shattered Space so unique. You're going somewhere else and really just going to be staying there. You won't be darting around to planets anymore, as this is considered a story largely just taking place in Va'ruun Kai, and even more specifically just taking place in Dazra, the capital city of Va'ruun Kai. In some recent interviews, Bethesda even added a bit of color to this. There's something about spending so much time in one location that attaches you to it, and in Shattered Space, everything happens in this location. We focused on making sure that every corner of this new area feels alive and has something for players to discover. Whether it's hidden side quests, unique encounters, or just the sheer beauty of the landscape, there's a lot to keep players engaged. It's less about the sheer size and more about the depth of the experience. In this interview, they continued on to explain how a bunch of custom assets were made to make this experience feel truly foreign. When you go to the House Va'ruun homeworld, it's going to feel quite different compared to the rest of the settled systems where you're playing in Starfield this entire time so far. They're doing things like adding on a new soundscape that is mysterious and even some more diverse landscapes to find. Even new lighting is going to be used here. The biggest challenge is probably taking and making the customized bespoke location as large as it is. When you think of a landed area in vanilla Starfield, base game Starfield, focusing everything that to customize that location and that experience, that was probably the most challenging part. So I was a bit confused by this. Is the landed area just the immediate city, or do they mean this entire map cell? But thankfully we got a bit of a more detailed response in another interview with Feed4Gamers. When the player arrives on Vurun Kai, the homeworld of House Vurun, they land in the city of Dazra, which is at the center of a handcrafted area similar in size to the areas you've experienced in the base game. That entire area is handcrafted. This follow-up quote, as well as some of the past mentions of how time-consuming it was to fill out this handcrafted area, makes me think that they're talking about one of these full map cells here, otherwise they likely would have just said a city. And this would be quite substantial. The surface maps in Starfield typically have the major location or city at the center, and then a bunch of random points of interest around the outskirts that you could travel to. But it sounds like, at least based off these descriptions for Shattered Space, that it's going to look around this size, but everything will be handcrafted. Later on in this video, we'll talk more about the size of Shattered Space, but we've seen from some of the leaked achievements that it'll have 50 locations at least to discover, and that would put it right on par with Far Harbor's. Far Harbor has around that exact number of locations, so you can expect something roughly that scale from this DLC. Which of course, when it comes to handcrafted content and just being on-foot exploration, that's super exciting. That sounds like a ton of fun. But to be clear, I could be interpreting this incorrectly, and even further, I would only expect one of these as the core of the Shattered Space experience. This one handcrafted cell is likely going to be most of the content, while the rest of the planet will be procedurally generated, although hopefully with some new and custom points of interest for Vurun Kai. I'll be curious to see if having that focused location and hey, I'm here and I'm experiencing this story in this focused place and I don't have to leave or travel around the galaxy, if that provides an experience that players were hungry for. Which at least for me, that is exactly the experience I'm hungry for. But I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments down below. So right off the bat, hopefully this paints a clear picture of how the Shattered Space experience is being set up to be quite different compared to the base game experience. Shattered Space is really just one planet with one major city, and major portions of that planet are fully handcrafted. And even if you don't trust Bethesda on that one, we have also heard this from third-party previews as well. Kotaku saw a preview at Gamescom earlier this year and said, the idea that there's a complete detailed story to play, all taking place in one confined location, alongside its fear-like atmosphere, has me wanting to return to the game for the first time since its launch week. And quite a few horror elements will be layered on top of all of this. Just generally, we've heard how the DLC is definitely designed with more experienced players in mind. We want to make sure the challenge and the story feel appropriately scaled for those who have already invested time into building up their characters. There are cosmic ghost stories, monster attacks from new species, and even what look like full-fledged survival horror sequences with stalking abominations. Bethesda just recently shared this tweet that breaks down some of the major features you can expect from Shattered Space, with formidable new enemies known as the Redeemed, as well as vortex horrors being some of these. Those new vortexes opening up on Vurun Kai seem to be the source of at least some of these new creatures. And they did kind of leak what exactly these will be, as last week Bethesda released the Shattered Space plushie set as a $3 microtransaction in Starfield, so you could actually buy plushie variants of several of the new creatures coming with Shattered Space. This is a groat, some kind of new animal that you could find on Vurun Kai. It doesn't seem to be a major threat, so I have to imagine this will be one of the passive animals that naturally occur on Vurun Kai. This is the Vortex Horror. We too can see this one in the trailer, and despite its name being rather vague with Vortex Horror, which could suggest a variety of types of enemy, it definitely seems like it could just be this one, as on the leaked achievements it has the exact same visual. Vortex Horrors are described as having more of an ambush element, creating startling moments as they jump scare you. And lastly, a Vurun Vasco, which is pretty curious. We can see these black Vasco skins from the trailer, but perhaps we can actually change the color of our own Vasco companion in this DLC. From those achievements, we can also see a listing for defeating 10 Redeemed. Considering this low number, I have to imagine there's going to be some kind of high-level zealot enemy. And that's not everything. It's not like we're only getting these new enemies. We also have seen a variety of other new enemies from this most recent trailer, but we've also heard how the flow of combat should be changing up with Shattered Space. Kotaku described how there's a push to force people to get more up close and personal, with ambushes, close quarter combat, and a great deal more panic. And even some of the other previews suggest that the combat in Shattered Space will have a more fast-paced and close combat nature, with some more aggressive enemy AI as well as a variety of new close-ranged weapons being added to accommodate this. Tim Lamb expanded on this in a recent interview, saying the dynamic with these new enemies, depending on the situation or the type of character you're playing, becomes more intense when someone is right in your face, which puts pressure on you to decide how to handle the situation. So it seems like enemies will be more threatening when they're right up in your face and very quickly try to get up in your face. Thankfully, there'll be a bunch of new weapons for us to take on these new threats, with at least one of these new weapons being new grenades we'll be able to craft. Stemming from organic materials, these are seemingly vortex grenades, which we can also see from the leaked achievements. It mentions crafting one of each type, and the image itself has 5 stars, so likely 5 new vortex grenade variants, with Xbox Wire describing how these appear to harness the power of the devastation in a spectacular way. But it seems like that'll really just be the combat side of Shattered Space, and conversely, on the story side, there'll be major political elements to this DLC. In the DLC, players will be able to explore their sacred sites, uncover the origins of their beliefs, and see how the Great Serpent influences their decisions. There's a power struggle within the faction itself between those who adhere to the traditional ways and those who believe it's time for a change. Players will have to navigate these internal conflicts, and their choices could determine the future of the Va'ruun house. We've seen Bethesda highlight how we haven't seen the last of the Va'ruun Zealots, General Spacers, or the Crimson Fleet Pirates. And that is because these will be the major players in this political struggle that we'll be entering into as we go to Va'ruun Kai. The rough understanding right now is, following this disarray caused by the opening of the vortexes on Va'ruun Kai, the Zealots, Spacers, and Crimson Fleet are all looking to fill a political void. And that of course means all sort of factional rivalry. So seemingly we'll have choices around siding with each of these 3 factions, as we'll also decide who ends up in control of Dazra. And this has the potential to be really good. The Crimson Fleet are naturally quite well fleshed out via their own questline, but both the Spacers as well as House Va'ruun Zealots are largely just death fodder enemies you can encounter in Starfield right now. Giving them a far more detailed story where you can actually interact with them is pretty exciting to me. It feels like it'll make some of the other interactions in Starfield a bit more meaningful as you return to them. But of course with this, there's the broader question of how much will Shattered Space impact the gameplay of Starfield. On Va'ruun Kai itself and its new isolated area, but also when you return to the broader settled systems. After you finish this questline, will things be different as a result of this expansion? And the answer is kind of yes, but largely no. The story is going to fill purposeful gaps in the lore about how and why Va'ruun society cut itself off from the rest of the settled systems, and also go some way to explain why Va'ruun Zealots have become a hostile force. And we're even teased with the idea that our decisions in this story can affect the wider galaxy once we're done. So while that is quite exciting, it sounds like which ending we choose for Shattered Space will have larger implications on the surrounding galaxy, but it seems like this will largely be lore or story implications as opposed to genuine gameplay changes. As in more recent interviews, we hear how things are indirectly impacted. I'd say indirectly in that you're a secluded location that's not initially discovered, but it's not isolated in such a way that items, equipment, or weapons are stuck there. You can bring everything you acquire back to the settled systems, and from past interviews we have heard how you can easily transport back and forth while going through this expansion. It's not like you're stuck on Va'ruun Kai or in that system as you're doing the questline. So for those of you hoping that Shattered Space would end up overhauling some of the core systems of Starfield, I think that's an unrealistic expectation. It sounds like there's going to be new armors, new weapons, and perhaps a new mechanic or two, but it doesn't seem like the game is going to be getting a 2.0 overhaul, at least from the paid content coming here. Although Shattered Space may have some tie-ins with Starfield's very unique New Game Plus mechanic, Tim Lamb explains how Shattered Space handles the Unity. It exists, but the loop is not required to enjoy Shattered Space. However, it would feel different replaying Shattered Space with New Game Plus. It has similar elements to other quests that you encounter with New Game Plus. It doesn't exist fully outside of that loop. So if I'm understanding this correctly, once you go through New Game Plus, some aspects of Shattered Space may switch around and be randomized, just like in Starfield's base game. That is a truly awesome feature, and while I don't necessarily love the gameplay implications of New Game Plus in the base game of Starfield, conceptually I do think going through to the Unity is a really cool feature, and seeing more content added to that is really nice. I'm happy they're doing that, and if anything, I hope they add more and more with future updates. But at least while you're actually in Va'ruun Kai, while you're doing the new content, there will be new mechanics for you to use. We've added a few new mechanics that we're really excited about. For example, there are new zero-gravity combat scenarios that really change the dynamic of how you approach fights. It adds a layer of strategy that wasn't there before. We've also introduced new ship customization options, which allows players to really tailor their vessels to their playstyle. And on the exploration front, there are new tools and gadgets that will help players interact with the environment in deeper and more meaningful ways. So So it does sound like these are expansion features, and based off that past quote, that it's not really changing much about the rest of the game, I have to imagine these new mechanics will largely be focused around the new DLC areas and not the rest of the worlds. And when it comes to that new zero gravity content, we have heard further explanations from Xbox Wire with how vortexes can even change how you explore, allowing you to effectively platform to out-of-the-way structures and pockets of zero-G. So there will be some larger segments of no gravity combat with Shattered Space, and that should definitely be interesting. As far as the new ship customization and exploration features, I have honestly no idea what to expect. Just a couple of days ago, one Reddit user posted saying that they heard from a community manager that the recently removed flip merging, which is an exploit that would effectively allow you to combine ship parts that typically wouldn't fit together, so you can make even larger and more epic ships. That was removed with an update, but reportedly it's going to become a core game feature later this month. So that's coming, but it more sounds like it'll be on the free side and not a part of this expansion. Because of course, there's also the question about Starfield's core gameplay loop. Many fans are hoping for a Cyberpunk 2.0 type of situation, an overhaul or expansion on many base game systems in addition to the DLC itself, and we have heard some details around some of the improvements that'll be coming to this game that won't be a part of the expansion paywall, although a lot of this is pretty high level. There's still improvements that we have that are outside of the scope of the new content. I'm actually personally excited at some of these community notes that I've seen go through. I don't want to specify them here, things could always change, but I saw some things go through that I was like, I can't wait until we can say that's a thing that we're doing. So yes, there will be. Outside of that, there are still quality of life improvements that are coming at the same time. So I'm hopeful this is going to largely be around points of interest. We recently saw a supposed leak that a point of interest overhaul is coming to Starfield. I would take that with a massive grain of salt. To me, it really feels like vehicles were part one of an exploration overhaul, but more and more engaging points of interest feel like a needed second step in an exploration overhaul. But at the very least, there has been quite a few clues that more vehicles will be coming either as a part of this DLC or otherwise. And funny enough, Phil Spencer, the head of Xbox, was reportedly asking for this as well. Come on, Todd, I want vehicles in this game. I'm tired of walking around this planet. But when it comes to the scope of Shattered Space for the $30 price tag, it should be more of what you expect. It feels like a traditional Bethesda expansion in scope and scale. Based off past expansions, that would put it at a solid 15 to 20 hour core experience. And with one of the leaked achievements mentioning 50 locations to discover, and assuming all of those locations are handmade, it would put it right on par with what we got from Far Harbor, assuming that is all of the locations on Varun Kai. And we've also heard how you could jump into this one fairly early on into Starfield. Pretty much after the initial entry into the game, you can go straight to the Shattered Space content. So through, Shattered Space should be the exact type of Bethesda expansion that we have gotten in the past, which for me sounds amazing. Bethesda has made some incredible expansions already, and when it comes to Starfield more specifically, it actually seems like Shattered Space will largely be a departure from the formula they used in the base game and a return to what they've been doing before, which I know for many fans is a really big piece of good news. But that isn't all. Starfield isn't ending with this expansion, as we also heard. We do plan to support our games for a long time, so we always have ideas going around in various levels of completeness, but we're always working on something. And while the updates coming to Starfield may be less frequent, they still do plan substantial updates, just like the ones we've seen over the course of 2024. For 2024, they were targeting every 6 weeks, and these exact style of updates will continue, just not every 6 weeks anymore. In past interviews, Todd Howard made it clear that he hopes to continue with yearly story expansions like this for Starfield, as long as the players continue to be interested. Although I honestly have no idea if that's going to happen. We've seen far lower player numbers for Starfield on Steam compared to the other Bethesda Game Studios games, but is that even a problem? Starfield had a massive console and PC Game Pass audience. If you're playing the game via Game Pass on PC, you're not popping up in the Steam number. So the number just may be unusually low compared to past releases because so many more people are on Game Pass. While with past releases, Game Pass wasn't a thing at the release of those games. And just generally, I'm very curious to see where the discourse surrounding Starfield goes from here. The reviews on Steam are bad, and while Shattered Space does genuinely sound like it'll be a major response to some of the biggest complaints with the base game, it sounds like it'll largely just be for the expansion content. The core of Starfield doesn't really seem like it's changing all that much from this new DLC or from some of the future updates. There are quite a few people holding out hope for some kind of 2.0 overhaul, and I have a feeling they might be waiting forever. As far as I can tell, we have never seen any indication that Bethesda is planning or going to do something like that. Obviously, it may come from modders, but who knows how long that could take. So the question becomes, if Shattered Space is really a positive DLC experience, will it be enough to pivot the view of Starfield in thousands of gamers' minds? And yeah, I don't know the answer to that one, but I'm very interested to find out. I know for me personally, this is by far far the most excited I've been for Starfield in a very long time. And look at some of the more recent mods to come out, you can tell that even with these somewhat troublesome mod tools, things are starting to seriously ramp up on the modding side, with some very promising things on the horizon. But if you want to see more about Starfield mods, get subscribed. I have a larger video on all of that coming before Shattered Space comes out.